Hello, this is Rabble Radio, recorded on Friday, May 23rd, 2025. I'm Brianne Doyle. Rabble.ca shares with you the news of the day through a progressive lens. If you're curious about what's happening in Canadian politics, labor, the environment, and beyond, you've come to the right place. This is news for the rest of us. Thanks for tuning in. It's been a big month in Canadian politics. With the election of Prime Minister Mark Carney and the rollout of his new cabinet, there's a lot to unpack. While the Liberals and Conservatives surged at the polls, smaller progressive parties like the NDP and the Greens saw their support take a hit, raising big questions about what comes next for progressive politics in Canada. That was the topic of this month's Off the Hill panel. We looked at what lies ahead, both on and off Parliament Hill, for the NDP and the Green Party. How can progressives keep pushing key policies forward? And how do we organize and stay active in a political landscape that is shifting toward the centre? This month we were joined by Mike Morrice, former Green Party MP for Kitchener Centre, Joel Harden, former Ontario NDP MPP and federal candidate in Ottawa Centre, poet, educator, and activist Al Jones, and Karl Nerenberg, rabble.ca's senior parliamentary reporter. Here is a small clip of that conversation. Take a listen.
All right, well, to start, a question for everybody. Let's get your general reflections on the federal election result. What surprised you? So why don't we start with Joel, then go to Mike, then Al, then Karl. Joel.
Well, thanks, Robin and Libby and everybody and folks tuning in for this opportunity to have this conversation tonight. Robin, if I'm going to think about what surprised me, I'll begin with the obvious. I mean, we were all looking at a Liberal Party which was in utter disarray before the end of last year, coming into this year. And I've been following politics for a long time. I have never seen an about face like we have just seen. And I think it had a lot to do with events south of the border, but we've seen the rise of demagoguery and fascism around the world. It's not just about south of the border. And sometimes as Canadians, we're a little too cute about the presence of hatred in our own communities. So I'm mindful of that, Robin. I'm mindful of the fear and the anxiety that's in our communities right now. I certainly hear it every day from folks at home. And mindful of the fact that despite all of that, I still think we are capable of some pretty impressive and amazing things as Canadians. I've seen a lot of people enjoying the tactic of boycotting and sanctioning the United States, as Canadians did in the 1980s with South Africa, as many Canadians are asking us to do with the case of Israel right now. So I'm mindful that this is a very difficult time. People are suffering. People are having a hard time. They're anxious. But I also know that we're a very powerful group of communities in this place we call Canada. So hopeful for our conversation tonight that we will explore that despite the difficult conditions.
Thank you. Before we go to Mike, I do want to throw in, you said you've never seen an about face like this. What about, wasn't Trump's an about face like this?
Yeah, I've never seen, well, first of all, a few things. I mean, I've never seen a reversal of fortune for a federal political party. And we are talking about the Liberals, however. This is the party that has been able to encapsulate many kinds of different political space for the history of itself, which is the history of this place, this country we call Canada. So a 26-point lead blown from Pierre Poilievre losing his own riding in my greater community here in Ottawa. These are all highly unexpected things. So, I mean, there's a lot of little details in here. Robin, you and I living in Ottawa will know that a lot of neighbors had been organizing behind the Bruce Vanjoy campaign for 2 years leading up to that result. So the national winds changed, but there was an organizing effort in Carleton, including New Democrats I work with who happen to live out there, particularly veterans and people who've been fighting for justice for veterans living with post-traumatic stress, and they felt Mr. Poilievre had all but ignored them. So the veterans community in that riding of Carleton organized en masse in that particular moment, as well as many others. So yes, I've never seen an about face like this. And it's, you know, Elle, you're in Nova Scotia, my partner's from Nova Scotia. Claire's mom always says, we can't control the wind, but we can adjust our sails. But man, that was a lot of wind. And some people were able to, like Mr. Fanjoy and others, were able to adjust their sail and take advantage of it. But it certainly had the opposite effect for my party. And we're doing a lot of soul searching right now about where we go from here.
Okay. All right. No, thanks. Mike, over to you from the election. What surprised you?
Well, first of all, I want to say thanks to Rabble for having me tonight. It's a real honor being on this panel with both Joel and Al. Libby, as someone who has followed your work for some time in Ottawa, I've been looking forward to this for a while. I'm calling in from the Haldeman Tract. It's Block 2 of the Haldeman Tract, what we know as Kitchener today, traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Adirondack people. To answer the question, though, Robin, I would first of all just agree with Joel. The shift, of course, like that's one of the main stories of this election. With only a change in leader that is further to the right, to see that kind of shift in fortunes is surprising. But to add something new, I would also say just the number of really incredible parliamentarians who did not get reelected. A lot of colleagues of mine in this last session. It's one of my big disappointments when I think about, Joel mentioned Haza already, if I think about the people who are going to be standing up against genocide and for human rights, there are fewer in this parliament. And also just outside of the issues, just those that were working hard, working across party lines, people like Taylor Backrack in BC, just like hardworking, eloquent community champion. And so it was surprising and disappointing to me to not see folks like that go back. There are many others who are going back, who are incredible parliamentarians. And it reminds me of how much we will need to continue to apply pressure on the causes we care about to make sure that that folks are being heard across the country in this parliament.
Elle, what surprised you?
Well, I lack the capacity to be surprised, Robin. I will say that, like many people, I had high hopes on Poilievre losing his seat, and we were certainly, I think the Stornoway squatters memes are some of the funniest things to come out of this election. Can I tell a joke that I didn't make up that's mildly offensive, I guess? Did you hear the joke? What's the difference between Per Poilievre and a toilet?
What?
They're both full of shit, but at least a toilet has a seat.
Now, as a host, I shouldn't laugh at that. So go on.
Okay, I didn't make it up. I'm just sharing it. I'm just passing it on. Retweets and not likes. I think obviously, I think everyone's already said, that it looked like we were all saying there was just a 100% Poilievre victory, 6 months ago, and now we're at a Liberal minority. I will say that we also saw this dynamic in the States with Biden. It's a dangerous one, right? Where everybody votes because they're like, oh no, chaos incoming. Let's vote for this unradical centrist who wants to keep everything the same. And we saw how under Biden that then turned into a second, much worse and much more radical Trump term. So I think there's always this danger that the right, we're calling them centrists, they're not. There's like soft right-wing liberals that come in that institute all kinds of austerity politics, conservative politics, completely abandon the progressive wing under the name of like normalcy, civility, being the adults in the room, etc., which just ends up alienating the left. It doesn't actually capture any of the people that are furious with them, which is the huge populist conservative base. And it ends up basically disillusioning and demotivating the actual people in the center. And the dynamic that leads to is often an even harder resurgence of the right. So I think that's going to be the worry coming up, is that Carney's going to govern like the banker he is. And I don't think this is the time for that. And I don't know if this, like, it was successful during the campaign to just pull this, like, I'm the adult here, like I'm wearing a suit, I'm not crazy. And, people wanted this idea of like a calm daddy or something in that moment. But I don't know how it's going to rise to meet the occasion in this like completely crumbling crisis world, right? So that's my concern coming out, is I think we've seen this happen already, and we've seen the massive failure of this kind of politics. And when you abandon like your progressive wing, and when you lose all sight of like progressive politics, it actually leads to not the adults in the room winning with the center, but a hard shift to the right. So.
Yep. No, thank you for that. And Karl, over to you.
I think Elle made a good point about that winning the election is the tiniest bit of the challenge for Carney and the current Liberals. Is what do you do now? and it's a little bit unclear as to where they're going to go. But what's a number of things that surprised me, to answer your question, to do it justice. I think I wasn't surprised at the turnaround that had the Liberals leading, but because at the time of the election, that had already been established, not just in the polling, but in the anecdotes. Like when I went into the supermarket, people, apolitical people, I gather, were all talking about very contemptuously about Poilievre, connecting him to Trump and saying we've all got to rally together as a country and get behind somebody to fight off Trump. So that seemed to be very much the zeitgeist. So what surprised me is that it didn't actually do as well as it might have when predicted by the general atmospherics. What surprised me in a way is how well the Conservatives did. And what surprised me is in a way there were two elections. There was the election of the one cohort of people, and I think a lot of it was generational. And they tended, this first cohort, to be older, not as old as me, but older than the older group. And they were really incredibly seized with the idea that there is a unhinged fascist in the White House who actually wants to take over Greenland, take over our country, wage economic war on us. And we were pretty aware that we had weakened ourselves over the last 50, 60 years, becoming far too integrated with the United States, and that we're making it easier for somebody who wants to pick on us. And some of us who knew history knew the Americans have long had ambitions to take over all or part of Canada or our resources. So that group of people went Liberal, and the part of that group who had been the NDP or Green massively deserted them. I remember just meeting people. It's like, for the first time in my life, I'm not going to vote NDP. I'm going to vote Liberal, just because of this aspect. But the other group were, I'm dissatisfied, I'm annoyed, I'll never be able to buy a house, groceries are too expensive. I find the government, maybe it's too cute and too woke by half, and I got sick of Trudeau, and I'm also sure this is big change. And they jumped on the Conservative bandwagon. I mean, Poilievre was right when he said, this is the best result the Conservatives have had since 1984, 88 or something. I mean, so yes, they lost. So, that's, the records of that sort are only for losers, but that poses a very dangerous situation going forward. That's a huge, huge vote for the Conservatives, huge support for the Conservatives. We had also the paradox of strategic voting in southwestern Ontario and other places, where confused progressives and confused working class people who jumped from the NDP to the Liberals elected Conservatives, but some of them also jumped to the Conservatives. So that is
I'm
also
going to jump in right there, because we're actually going to move over to strategic voting. So I'm just, if you don't mind, I'm just going to jump in and bring Joel back in. I know we want to get into what's next, but let's just stick for a little bit with the actual election itself and what happened and your reflections. Joel, I know you ran a very energetic campaign. I kind of watched from afar on the West Coast. It was a fantastic campaign. But as everybody has said, strategic voting, it was clearly a huge factor in the outcome. So I guess a couple questions. What lessons are you drawing from that? And we will get into the question of electoral reform later on in our questions to you, but just in terms of the strategic voting, as Karl referenced, and what do we draw from that? And also, if you just want to reflect a little bit on how are you seeing the NDP's immediate role in Parliament? And there's the leadership race as well coming up with Jagmeet Singh resigning as leader. So that's a lot of questions, but just reflections you have on strategic voting and what's next for the NDP, really.
Look, I will say a few things, Libby. First of all, Canadians have said from coast to coast to coast that we want electoral reform. We want it. But in the absence of the two major parties offering it, despite promises from the Liberals to do so, they do it as well as they hope to do at the polls. This is what we experienced here in Ottawa Centre. We had 50,000 votes for the Liberal candidate in Ottawa Centre. That is historic. No one has ever registered an outcome like that here at any level of politics. And I think they wanted to send Poilievre and Trump a message. It's very clear to me. So when I have neighbors approach me at home, regretfully saying, "Oh, Joel, I decided not to back you this time," there's not a hint of anger in my mind. I know people wanted to send a message. I get it. The question is for the party, for the NDP, how do we understand this moment? As I said before, referencing that East Coast metaphor I got from my partner's family, we cannot control what swirls around at the top of politics as local community activists. If we try to, we'll drive ourselves mad. But what we certainly can control is how we react to this moment. Mr. Carney's got a lot of contradictions he's got to manage with the daily sideshow in the White House. He's been hired for that job, and we'll see if he can actually pull that off. He also, if I give credit to him, talked about some significant changes to our political economy that our party has been proposing, as you know, Libby, for 40 years, all the way back to Mel Watkins and Ed Broadbent and Rosemary Brown, people who were saying, we want to actually use the stuff that we make here for here. We want to be a model of an independent, resilient economy that serves our communities. And we want to encourage that all around the world. This is what New Democrats have been saying for 40 years. So Mr. Carney is talking about reverse integration of the economy, closing supply chains. Here locally in Ottawa, we actually have a situation where our neighbors on the other side of the Ottawa River in Gatineau in Quebec, they have a completely different hydroelectricity system. If we were to connect with that system, we would make game-changing moves in our emissions reductions. But decades of Liberal and Conservative politicians have said no. And why? Because Enbridge wants to bring up fracked natural gas from the United States to compensate for how we draw down our electricity in the province of Ontario. But if Mr. Carney is serious, this is what I'm hearing from local community activists, Libby, in the NDP and outside. We're going to hold him to these promises. We're still going to be the official opposition in our city. We don't need an elected seat to do that. We need an active citizenry, and we have that. We have that in Ottawa Centre, and I know that exists all over the country. Now, as for the leadership race, this is a really important moment for the federal NDP. We have to decide what will lead us back into electoral relevance. What is absolutely beyond debate is that we have political relevance in every community in this country. It doesn't matter what happened in these larger national wins, international wins that impacted this result. Our party is respected in big communities, small communities, suburban communities, rural communities, urban communities like mine. We have that. The question is, are we going to look for a leader who's going to make sure we can build on that local expertise that we have by encouraging community organizing at a local level? Or are we going to rely on very high-priced consultants in Ottawa, in Toronto, and Vancouver to direct us from above? That is, I think, the debate we need to have. And I'll end by saying it's not always straightforward. I believe we need a well-funded national leadership. I believe that national leadership needs good advice. I'm not saying that shouldn't happen. But to give you, I'll end with an anecdote. As I served at Queen's Park in Toronto, and we went over the budget for the 2022 provincial election campaign, we had a $7 million budget for that campaign. $5 million of that $7 was spent promoting our leader, who had run as our leader 4 times. And many of us said to ourselves, why did we do that? Why didn't we get people booked off work as bona fide candidates a year ahead of the vote? In the other major political parties, and Mike, I know you work on this premise too, like you get ready long ahead of the writs being issued. You listen to what community members want to see happening in their community long before the writs are issued. And I want to see our party emulate that model, but it takes really intentional investment. It takes sitting down with local folks who want to make that risk, put themselves out, and then build a community of people around them. If we want a federal leader who's going to focus on organizing, I think the sky's the limit for the NDP and frankly, any other political party.
Thanks, Joel. Brilliant.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. Mike, being excluded from the federal election leadership debates undoubtedly impacted the Green Party to some degree. How would you define the challenges that lie ahead? And do you see this as a period of maintaining the status quo or one of potential growth?
Well, Robin, The challenges that lie ahead are the housing crisis. It is folks with disabilities disproportionately living in poverty across the country. It is the gouging of the oil and gas industry and grocery chains that continue to get by unabated, whereas other countries around the world have long put in place windfall profit taxes to return that to communities to invest in good transit. We're still the only country in the G7 without high-speed rail. Our emissions are the only one in the G7 that continue to go up. And so I think you're asking about the Green Party, but in my view, political parties are a means to an end to achieve outcomes for people. And the challenges for folks in this country on any of those fronts, all of them have gotten worse. To Karl's earlier, I don't fully agree with the kind of two buckets of people that Karl shared about earlier, but the fact that anybody who cares about the housing crisis would see any solutions in the Conservative Party is a failure amongst those who have real solutions to communicate those widely. Solutions like making sure that when the Government of Canada builds so-called affordable housing, that the homes are actually affordable for regular folks. Because right now, if you look at the Affordable Housing Fund, and 70% of the units built in that
That was a short clip from our latest Off the Hill panel on post-election plans and possibilities, featuring former Green Party Member of Parliament for Kitchener Centre, Mike Morrice, former provincial NDP MPP for Ottawa Centre and federal candidate for Ottawa Centre, Joel Harden, poet and activist Al Jones, and Rabble senior parliamentary reporter Karl Nerenberg. To watch the panel in its entirety, visit us over on Rabble TV or Rabble's YouTube channel. And now, this is our In Case You Missed It segment, where we review the top stories from this week on rabble.ca. For that, let's go to Rabble editor Nick Seabrook. Over to you, Nick.
Thanks, Brianne. Starting this week with news from Ontario. The Ontario branch of the Canadian Union of Public Employees, CUPE, is warning that Premier Doug Ford is making an authoritarian grab for power in the form of Bill 5. Bill 5 would allow the Ontario Provincial Cabinet to designate parts of the province as special economic zones. Within these zones, provincial laws protecting the environment can be suspended, as well as laws regulating the protection of workers. There is no restriction on the size of these special zones, as they can include a park, a neighborhood, a city, or a whole region of the province. The province can then allow for private corporations to go into those special zones to take on pre-approved projects for economic development, such as building a hospital or extracting resources through activities like mining. It is not only labor leaders who are sounding the alarm about Bill 5. First Nations communities are also voicing their opposition, stating that Bill 5 violates their treaty rights by allowing the province to ignore their duty to consult with them. Bill 5 has passed second reading in the legislature and is currently being debated in committee. In labor news, employees at the Workers' Safety and Insurance Board, also known as the WSIB, began strike action on Wednesday, May 21st. The board's workers, represented by CUPE Local 1750, and their employer have been embroiled in collective bargaining talks for weeks, with some bargaining days taking up to 14 hours. The union says workers' main concerns include workload, wages, and union representation. Beyond pay issues, CUPE is also citing widespread mental health issues resulting from unfair workloads as another major point of contention. In 2024, the Occupational Health Clinics for Ontario Workers conducted a survey on WSIB employees and found that 56% of respondents said the WSIB workplace is toxic. WSIB said that they remain ready to negotiate, but have not had communication with the union since Monday. In national news, feminist organizations are celebrating the return of the Minister for Women and Gender Equality to the federal cabinet. Liberal MP Richie Valdez was named the new Minister of Women and Gender Equality last week when Prime Minister Mark Carney announced his new cabinet. The ministry was removed from cabinet by Carney in his first cabinet that he had announced prior to the 2025 election. Up until that point, there had always been a minister for women or women's issues in cabinet in one form or another. Organizations like the Canadian Research Institute for the Advancement of Women said it was encouraging to see Carney return the Minister for Women to cabinet, especially with the rise of anti-feminist movements around the world. Jackie Neopole, Executive Director of the Canadian Research Institute for the Advancement of Women, said in a quote, "Dedicated leadership and resources, accountability, and sustained action is needed in government to work toward equality for all women in Canada." End quote. Also this week, Rabble shared a speech given by Off the Hill host Robin Brown at the United Nations last month. Brown gave a presentation on judicial racial bias to the fourth meeting of the UN Permanent Forum on People of African Descent at UN headquarters in New York on April 14th. Brown told the Assembly that in addition to Canadian judges being resistant to receiving training on unconscious bias, judges were left up to themselves to decide if they harbored any bias at all. He explained that the Canadian justice system was not designed to hold judges accountable for bias, saying that there is, quote, a lack of requirement for judges to do conflict checks like lawyers must do, to avoid presiding over trials where they might have conflicts of interest with the parties involved, end quote. And finally, in an article on Rabble, David Suzuki explains how geoengineering is a dangerous distraction from dealing with the real issues causing climate change. Geoengineering is using technology to manipulate the world's climate, like putting more iron in the ocean so that it reflects more solar rays back into space. Suzuki explains, however, that many solutions like these can have unforeseen consequences, such as killing life in the oceans. The real way to deal with climate change, Suzuki says, is to end humanity's reliance on fossil fuels and to move the world's economy towards green, renewable energy. As always, you can read the full version of all the stories we talked about today on rabble.ca.
Thanks, Nick. And that's it for Rabble Radio this week. Thank you as always for tuning in. If you like the show, please consider subscribing to Rabble Radio on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. And please rate, review, share Rabble Radio with your friends. It takes 2 seconds to support independent media like Rabble. Thank you to all the journalists and writers who contributed to this week's content on rabble.ca, and thank you to Karl Nerenberg for supplying the music. Lastly, thank you to you for tuning in to Rabble Radio. I'm Brianne Doyle, and I'll talk to you next week.